Go ahead, I told them, folding my hands over the polished walnut table. Smile while you still can. The room went quiet for half a second after I said it, not because anyone understood what I meant, but because they were trying to decide whether I was joking. Then Vanessa laughed first, light and breathy, the same way she laughed at charity luncheons and neighborhood Christmas parties when she wanted everyone to think she was the warmest woman in the room. My son Daniel followed a beat later, though his laugh sounded thinner, uncertain, like a man stepping onto a frozen lake and hoping it would hold. Around them, the others relaxed. My late husband's nephews reached for coffee. My granddaughter Ashley crossed one elegant leg over the other and checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. Every face around that table carried the same hidden calculation. They thought this was the day I finally gave in. They thought this was the day I gave them exactly what they wanted. The dining room had once been the heart of our home. 40 years of Thanksgiving dinners had passed through those walls. Birthday cakes, retirement toasts, graduation photos, Easter hams cooling on the sideboard, all of it. Back when my husband Walter was alive, the room had felt full in the right way. Loud, yes. Crowded, certainly. But never hungry. Not like this. This hunger had a different sound to it. It was softer, better dressed. It wore pearl earrings and pressed navy blazers and expensive watches. It asked whether I needed help with my medicine while glancing toward the hallway that led to my office. It complimented the roast chicken while estimating the value of the china. It told me to take my time, then check the grandfather clock every 3 minutes. I saw all of it. I had been seeing it for much longer than they knew. Vanessa sat to Daniel's right in a cream sweater set that probably cost more than my first car. She had one hand resting lightly on his sleeve, as if she were there to steady him, but I knew better. Vanessa never steadied anything unless she could guide it where she wanted it to go. She had perfected the art of looking concerned while rearranging everyone's lives. Margaret, she said, using the voice she reserved for doctors, bank managers, and church women with influence. We just want whatever brings you peace. Peace. That was the word she liked to use when she wanted surrender to sound graceful. Daniel nodded without meeting my eyes. He had my husband's shoulders and none of his courage. At 43 years old, he still looked like a boy whenever he was ashamed, which would have moved me once. Years ago, I would have softened at the first crack in his expression. I would have made excuses for him. Told myself he was under pressure. Told myself marriage changed people. Told myself the right thing at the wrong time could still become the right thing if a mother stayed patient long enough. But patience, I had learned, is often mistaken for blindness by people who have never had to survive on dignity alone. I appreciate that, I said. I reached for my teacup, though I did not drink from it. The tea had gone cold 10 minutes earlier. No one had noticed. And I know you've all been waiting for clarity. That landed exactly as I expected. Ashley looked up at once. One of Walter's nephews leaned forward. Vanessa's smile deepened by the smallest degree, but enough for me to catch it. She thought the day was turning in her favor. She thought the months of whispered calls, careful suggestions, and not so subtle remarks about my age had finally worked. She thought I had tired of resisting. She did not know that tired women can be the most dangerous kind when they stop asking to be loved fairly and start paying attention instead. Outside the long windows, the February sky hung low and silver over the back lawn. The fountain Walter had installed 20 years earlier sat still in the cold, its basin rimmed with a thin line of ice. I remember thinking the yard looked honest in winter. Bare trees never pretended to be full. Dead grass did not try to pass for green. Only people did that. Only people decorated greed with concern and called it family. You've all been very invested in these decisions, I said, keeping my voice calm, almost gentle. So I thought it would be best to settle matters directly. Vanessa lowered her eyes, playing humility for the room. We only want what's fair, she said. There it was again. Fair. Another one of her polished little words. Fair was selling my husband's vintage truck before the first anniversary of his death because, in her opinion, it took up garage space. Fair was suggesting I move into the downstairs guest room so Daniel and she could renovate the primary suite for resale value. Fair was asking whether it made sense for me to keep control of accounts that would one day need simpler management. Fair was never about kindness. Fair was just greed that had learned table manners. I let the silence stretch, because silence has weight when you are not afraid of it. People feel it if you give them enough rope. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, nobody's trying to rush you. He said it too quickly. Ashley glanced at him, annoyed. One of the nephews looked down at the folder in front of my place setting, then back at me, then away. I almost smiled. They were all trying so hard to appear patient that the performance itself had become pathetic. No, I said softly. You've all been very patient. And that was when I slid my fingertips over the folder and turned it a quarter inch toward them, just enough to make every set of eyes in the room lock onto it. Not one of them looked at me then. Not one. They looked at the paper. At the possibility of the house, the investment accounts, the jewelry in the upstairs safe, the parcels of land Walter had held on to outside Asheville, the things they had already begun dividing in their minds long before I ever agreed to this meeting. I saw it plainly in their faces, and for the first time in months, I felt something almost like peace. Because when people stop pretending, they become predictable. And predictable people are easy to beat. Don't worry, I said, resting my palm over the folder as Vanessa's smile sharpened with anticipation. By the end of today, you'll have exactly what you asked for. Vanessa was the first to reach for the folder with her eyes, though she did not move her hand. That would have been too obvious, and obvious was beneath her. She preferred the cleaner method, the kind that let everyone else feel as though they had arrived at the same conclusion on their own. You have always known how to make an entrance, Margaret, she said with a smile so polished it could have come. In a velvet jewelry box. Even now. I looked at her for a moment, long enough for the smile to hold, then tighten, then settle again. She had spent years perfecting that face. The warm daughter-in-law. The practical woman. The one who sent flowers to church friends after surgery and handwritten notes after funerals. She knew how to stand in a doorway with a casserole dish and look like grace itself. What she had never understood was that a woman can learn more from watching than from speaking. And I had been watching Vanessa Cole since the day she walked into my kitchen 12 years earlier wearing a pale blue sundress and calling me Miss Whitmore as though respect and distance were the same thing. Daniel used to have an open face. You could read him in one glance when he was young. If he lied about breaking a lamp, his ears went pink. If he skipped class, his eyes darted to the left. But somewhere between law school loans I helped pay off and the expensive wedding I never complained about, my son learned a new kind of silence. Not the honorable kind. The convenient kind. The kind that lets a man sit beside wrongdoing and call it peacekeeping. He rested his forearms on the table now and gave me a careful look, the kind a person gives a skittish horse. Mom, he said, before we get too deep into all this, I just want to say we are grateful you brought everyone together. Grateful. Another elegant word doing ugly work. Ashley straightened in her chair. Walter's nephews, Grant and Russell, each picked up their coffee cups without drinking. They all knew this was the moment the weather in the room might change. I thought it was time, I said. There is no use leaving important things vague. That sentence pleased them. I could see it. Greed brightens a face faster than joy ever does. Vanessa folded her hands in front of her, her wedding ring catching the winter light from the windows. It is sensible, she said. Especially now. She did not define now, but she did not need to. Now meant my age. Now meant the second birthday after Walter's funeral. Now meant the fact that I had begun carrying reading glasses in every room and had once forgotten where I put the silver cake server after. Christmas dinner. To them, age was evidence. Forgetfulness was opportunity. Independence was a problem waiting to be solved. I slid the folder an inch closer to the center of the table, but kept my hand resting on top of it. They watched that hand as if it were the last card in a casino game. Before anything is read, I said, I want to understand something. Vanessa tilted her head. Daniel's jaw tightened. Of course, she said. What is it? I turned my gaze from one face to the next, making sure each of them felt seen. When did this become so urgent for all of you? No one answered at first. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked once, then again. Ashley broke eye contact and reached for her water. Grant cleared his throat into his fist. Daniel gave the smallest laugh, meant to soften the question. It is not urgent, Mom. No, I asked. Then I must have misunderstood the calls. The ones asking whether I really needed the upstairs. The suggestions about simplifying my accounts. The concern over whether the house was too much for me. The questions about whether I had updated paperwork. The way every family dinner for the last 6 months has somehow circled back to estate planning before dessert. Vanessa's expression did not crack, but it shifted. Only by a hair, but enough. That was concern, she said. You live alone in a very large house. I do, I said. And yet I have managed to survive in it beautifully. Daniel looked down at the table. He knew I was right. He also knew he had stood by while Vanessa planted each of those ideas, one after another, as gently as nails tapped into wood. Not loud enough to alarm anyone, just steady enough to build something. No one is questioning that, he said. We are just trying to be realistic. There it was. Realistic. The most dangerous word of all when spoken by people who want something that belongs to someone else. Realistic meant transfer the power before the funeral. Realistic meant call pressure responsibility and call appetite planning. I leaned back in my chair and let them sit with it. Outside, the wind moved through the bare oak branches at the edge of the lawn. The sound brushed faintly against the windows, like fingers over silk. Walter used to say you could tell what kind of winter it would be by the way the branches moved in February. He had also said, once, after a business partner tried to outmaneuver him, that the easiest person to fool is the one who has already spent the money in his head. I remember laughing at the time. Now the memory felt less like humor and more like instruction. Vanessa drew a breath and placed one manicured hand over Daniel's. Margaret, she said softly, I know this is emotional, but nobody here wants to upset you. We just want transparency, so there are no misunderstandings later. It was an excellent line. Measured, gracious, impossible to challenge without looking unreasonable. That was her specialty. She never pushed directly when she could wrap the blade in linen first. Transparency, I repeated. I agree completely. That answer seemed to reassure everyone at once. Ashley sat up again. Russell set down his cup. Daniel finally looked at me, hopeful and wary in equal measure. They thought I was yielding to the language of fairness, realism, transparency. They thought the old house, the accounts, the land outside Asheville, the things Walter and I had built over 4 decades were about to pass into eager hands under the soft lighting of good manners. What they still did not understand was that I had spent the better part of a year listening to every careful phrase, every polished concern, every strategic pause, and with each one I had become less wounded and more certain. I was not opening the folder because I had run out of strength. I was opening it because they had finally shown me enough. I lifted my hand from the cover and watched the room lean toward me without meaning to. Then I opened the folder at last and said, very calmly, since we all value transparency so much, let us begin with what each of you believed would happen here today. No one spoke at first. It was almost impressive, the way a room full of people with opinions could fall so completely silent when asked to say the quiet part out loud. Ashley looked down at her water glass as though it had suddenly become fascinating. Grant shifted in his chair and glanced at Russell, who gave the smallest shrug, the kind men give when they hope someone else will be foolish enough to go first. Daniel rubbed his thumb against the edge of his wedding band. Vanessa, however, recovered faster than the others. She always did. She sat a little straighter, smoothed one hand over the tablecloth, and gave me a look meant to suggest patience rather than discomfort. I do not think anyone came here with expectations, she said. Only questions. I let that sit between us. Really, I said. That is interesting. Her smile held, but now it looked more careful than warm. What is that supposed to mean? It means, I said, turning the first page in the folder without letting them see the contents, that people who come with only questions do not usually arrive with opinions about who should take over the household accounts. They do not usually have recommendations for listing agents before the owner has even discussed moving. And they certainly do not begin dividing furniture in casual conversation over lemon pie. Ashley's eyes flicked up then, startled. She should have hidden it better. Last Thanksgiving, she had stood in the breakfast room holding a slice of pie in one hand and told Vanessa that the grandfather clock would look stunning in her downtown condo if they removed the brass weights and had the wood lightened. She had not known I was standing in the pantry doorway, just out of sight, holding a serving spoon and listening to every word. At the time, I said nothing. I had become very good at saying nothing. Silence unsettles people more when they are certain they should have gotten away with something. Grandma, Ashley said now, her voice softening into the sweet register she had used as a child when she wanted extra spending money. Nobody was dividing anything. We were just talking. Of course, I said. That is what people always say when they are caught revealing themselves too early. Grant gave a low breath through his nose, almost a laugh. then seemed to think better of it. Russell stared at the center of the table as if deeply invested in the grain of the walnut. Daniel looked miserable, which I might have mistaken for conscience if I had not seen the pattern too many times before. My son did not step forward when it mattered. He waited to see which way the wind was blowing, then called the result unfortunate. "Mom," he said, "this is starting to feel unfair." That word again. Unfair. It floated around our family now like an expensive room spray, meant to cover the smell without cleaning anything underneath. Unfair. I asked. "You think it is unfair for me to ask what each of you expected from this afternoon?" "You are putting people on the spot," he said. Vanessa touched his sleeve, a small gesture for the room, but I saw what it really was. Guidance. Correction. Reminding him not to let his nerves speak before she had shaped the message. "Margaret," she said, calm as polished marble, "if what you want is honesty, then I will be honest. I think everyone has been worried. You are alone in a house this size. There is a great deal to manage. We all know you have had a difficult couple of years. It is not cruel to acknowledge reality. There are moments when truth arrives so cleanly that it almost feels like a favor." Hearing Vanessa say it that way, with concern wrapped around the blade, I understood that she truly believed her own language made her decent. She believed that if she softened her voice enough, no one could accuse her of trying to move a living woman out of the center of her own life. "No," I said quietly. "It is not cruel to acknowledge reality. So let us do exactly that." I turned another page. Still, I did not let them read. I wanted them listening, not scanning ahead for figures. The reality is this. Walter has been gone for 22 months. In that time, I have paid every bill on schedule. I have maintained this property without help from anyone at this table. I have met with our accountant, reviewed the investments, renewed the insurance policies, and handled every tax document that came through this house. I have done so without confusion, without crisis, and without needing a committee. No one interrupted. They could not, because every word was true. The reality is also that within 6 months of my husband's funeral, I began receiving suggestions. Kind ones at first. Questions about whether I still drove at night, whether I wanted to keep all the upstairs rooms open, whether it would be easier if someone else had access to my accounts in case of emergency. Then came the more practical conversations. Restructuring, downsizing, simplifying, protecting me from stress. Always for my benefit, never for theirs, at least not in the language you chose. Vanessa folded her hands more tightly. Daniel stared at the table. Ashley's cheeks colored. Good. Shame, even in small doses, can be clarifying. "We were trying to help," Daniel said at last, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," I said. "Some of you may even have believed that. But what you were really trying to do was get me to surrender ownership before you had earned inheritance." Grant looked up then. That landed. Not because he disagreed, but because he recognized himself in it. He and Russell had not been as polished as Vanessa. Men like them rarely are. Their greed showed up in practical little comments about maintenance costs, property taxes, market timing. Numbers gave them cover. They liked to act as though appetite became wisdom if you dressed it in spreadsheets. "That is not fair," Russell muttered. "No," I said. "Then tell me, Russell, why did you ask my groundskeeper in October whether he thought the back parcel could be subdivided?" The room changed after that. Not dramatically. Nobody gasped. Nobody slammed a hand on the table. That would have been too easy, too theatrical. Instead, everything tightened. Faces, shoulders, mouths. It was the tightening of people who suddenly realized the pleasant old woman at the head of the table has been keeping score in silence for much longer than they imagined. Russell blinked at me. Grant turned his head slowly. Ashley looked from one face to another, measuring damage. Vanessa did not move at all, but something behind her eyes sharpened. She was finally beginning to understand the shape of the afternoon. "I did not think so," I said. "Now, since we are being honest, I will answer the question none of you had the courage to ask directly. Yes, I know exactly what this meeting means to you. I know what each of you hoped would happen here today. And before anyone says another word about concern, fairness, or realism, I think it is time you understand something far more important." I rested one finger on the next page in the folder and looked directly at Vanessa. "I knew what you were doing months before you realized I had stopped pretending not to notice." Vanessa did not blink. That was one of the things that made her dangerous to people who only looked at surfaces. Most people think guilt announces itself with shaking hands, or a cracked voice, or some dramatic refusal to meet your eyes. But the practiced ones do not unravel that way. The practiced ones become still. They grow quieter. They start weighing each word before it leaves their mouth, like a jeweler testing gold. Vanessa sat there in her cream sweater, shoulders relaxed, chin level, and gave me a look that might have passed for confusion to anyone who had not spent years watching her work a room. "I do not know what you think I was doing," she said. "But if you were suggesting I had some kind of plan, that is simply not true." "No," I asked. "Then perhaps I imagined the lunch at the club last spring when you told Ellen Burrows that large houses become burdens for widows and that grown children sometimes need to step in before sentiment turns into mismanagement." Her expression changed then, not much, but enough. A tiny pause before she answered. A flicker in the eyes. Not fear yet. Just recalculation. Ellen Burrows belonged to the kind of country club women who carried news from one luncheon to the next under the cover of sympathy. Vanessa knew exactly what she was doing when she said those words within earshot of Ellen. She was planting a story in polished soil and trusting the right people to water it. "That was a general comment," Vanessa said. "You are taking it personally because you are upset." I smiled then, though not warmly. "I am taking it accurately." Daniel shifted beside her. He had the look of a man realizing the script in his head no longer matched the scene in front of him. "Mom, maybe we should slow this down," he said. "Everybody is getting tense." "Everybody?" I asked. "Or just the people discovering that I have a better memory than they hoped?" Grant let out a breath and sat back in his chair. Ashley kept her gaze fixed on the silver sugar bowl in the middle of the table, as though it might split open and rescue her from the conversation. Russell had gone pale around the mouth. "Good. Let them all feel the weight of being fully seen. It is a rare thing, and not always a pleasant one." I closed the folder for a moment and rested both hands on it. The leather felt cool beneath my palms. Walter had given me that folder years ago, after a real estate dispute with a developer who thought charm and pressure could force a signature. My husband had come home that night, loosened his tie, and set the folder on the kitchen counter. "Never argue when records will do the job better," he had said. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. I understand now that he was talking about life. "You all assumed something about me," I said, looking from face to face. "You assumed that because I still set an extra place in my head before dinner, because I still reach for Walter when I wake in the middle of the night, because grief made me quieter than it used to, that I had also become easier to move, easier to influence, easier to manage." No one interrupted. "You mistook mourning for weakness," I said. "That was your first mistake." Outside, a gust of wind moved across the lawn hard enough to stir the bare branches against the winter sky. Inside, the room remained perfectly still. The good china sat untouched. The coffee had gone lukewarm. The little crystal dish of lemon candies near the end of the table remained full because greed leaves no appetite for sweetness. "When did you first realize?" Daniel asked suddenly. His voice came out quieter than before, almost boyish. That question, at least, was honest. I turned toward him. "August," I said. "Maybe earlier, if I am being truthful with myself." But August was when it became impossible to ignore. Vanessa glanced at him sharply. She did not like unscripted questions. They weakened the fabric. They let daylight through the seams. "What happened in August?" Ashley asked before she could stop herself. I looked at her. She still had her mother's pretty mouth and her father's talent for wanting comfort without cost. "You all left early after Daniel's birthday dinner," I said. "Do you remember?" None of them answered, but I could tell they did. It had been one of those heavy summer evenings when the air held the smell of cut grass and citronella candles. I had made pot roast because Daniel still liked it the way he had when he was 10 years old, with mashed potatoes and too much gravy. Vanessa brought a bottle of wine no one opened. Ashley spent most of the evening texting. Grant and Russell arrived late, left early, and talked too long on the back patio about market conditions. Ordinary things. Family things. At least that is how it looked on the surface. "You thought I had gone upstairs," I said. I had not. I was in Walter's study looking for an insurance file I could not find. The door was nearly closed. The hallway carried sound. Vanessa's eyes narrowed by the slightest degree. Daniel went very still. "I heard my own life discussed as though I were a scheduling problem," I said. Not cruelly. That would almost have been easier. "No, you all sounded reasonable. Thoughtful. Strategic." Vanessa said it might be kinder to make decisions sooner rather than later. Grant said the property values were strong and timing mattered. Russell said estates lose money when families wait too long to act. Ashley asked whether anyone knew what would happen to the silver. And my son, my only son, said he did not want conflict but agreed something needed to be done before things became complicated. Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. Only one. Then he opened them again, and I saw it on his face at last. Not courage, not quite remorse, but the dawning recognition that a private conversation had not remained private. "Mom," he said, almost whispering, "that was not how it sounded." "It is exactly how it sounded," I said, because I was there to hear it. Vanessa leaned back, crossing one leg with deliberate care. She had moved from defense into strategy now. When denial no longer works, people like her do not collapse. They pivot. "Even if that conversation happened the way you remember it," she said, "concern about the future is not a crime." "No," I said, "it is not. Which is why I did not confront you then." That surprised them. I could see it. They expected tears, outrage, accusation. They expected the kind of wounded response they knew how to talk around. What they had never prepared for was patience. "I listened," I said. Then I paid attention. I stopped dismissing patterns as accidents. I started noticing who brought up paperwork, who asked questions about deeds, account access, and power of attorney, who floated the word fair whenever money was nearby. I let you keep talking because every polished concern revealed more than anger ever would. I lifted the folder again and opened it slowly to the next section. The paper made a crisp sound in the quiet room. "That was when I stopped wondering whether I was being unkind in my suspicions," I said, and started deciding exactly what to do about them. No one moved after I said it. Not because they had nothing to say, but because people rarely know what to do when they realize someone they dismissed has been quietly gathering the truth. Vanessa kept her posture elegant, though I noticed the small change in her breathing. Daniel stared at the open folder as if he might find mercy in the paper. Ashley looked young all of a sudden, not innocent, just young in the way people do when consequences finally reach them. Grant and Russell sat with the stiff discomfort of men who had spent too long assuming they were the most practical people in the room. I let the silence hold for another few seconds. Silence is useful that way. It allows other people to hear their own thoughts, and most of them do not enjoy the sound. "What exactly did you do?" Vanessa asked at last. Her tone was measured, but the softness had gone out of it. That was fine with me. I preferred her without the lace wrapped around the blade. "I paid attention," I said. Then I became organized. I drew one sheet from the folder and set it on the table in front of me, still too far away for them to read. After that dinner in August, I stopped explaining things away. I began writing down dates, comments, questions, suggestions that seemed harmless by themselves, but looked very different once they were placed side by side. Daniel gave a faint shake of his head. "Mom, you made a file on us?" "No," I said. "I made a record for myself. There is a difference. One is revenge. The other is clarity." That landed harder than anything else I had said so far, because it left them no easy role to assign me. Angry women are convenient. Bitter widows are simple. Confused older mothers are easy to manage. But a calm woman with records is another matter entirely. Those are the women people underestimate right up until the moment the room changes shape. "This is unbelievable," Ashley murmured, though she sounded less offended than nervous. "No," I said. "What would have been unbelievable is if I had heard all of you discussing my future like a property transfer and done nothing at all." I turned the sheet over and placed it back in the folder. Then I looked at Daniel. "Do you remember September 12th? He frowned, searching his memory. Vanessa did not look at him. She was already trying to calculate where this was going. "No," he said carefully. "Should I?" "It was a Tuesday," I said. "You called just after 7 in the evening. You asked whether I had updated my healthcare directives. Then you asked whether my bank still required in-person authorization for account access in emergencies. You tried to make it sound casual, but you asked the questions in a row, almost as if someone had prepared them." Daniel's face changed. Not because he remembered only then. Because he did remember. He remembered exactly. "That was a normal conversation," he said. "A son checking on his mother. A son checking whether his mother's control over her own affairs could be bypassed under the right conditions," I said. "Do not insult either of us by pretending otherwise." Vanessa finally spoke. You are taking ordinary family concern and turning it into some kind of legal case. No, I said. I am taking repeated patterns seriously, which is what sensible people do when too many ordinary moments begin pointing in the same direction. I drew out another sheet. October 3rd. Ashley asked whether the jewelry inventory had been appraised recently because, and I quote, pieces can disappear in big old houses. October 18th. Russell asked my groundskeeper whether the back parcel had road access from the county line because that would matter for development. November 2nd. Grant asked whether the trust still held the mountain acreage or whether title had been moved after Walter died. November 19th. Vanessa offered to help me with my mail and lingered over a letter from our estate attorney for just a little too long. No one interrupted me. They could not. The details were too specific. Dates have a way of draining the air from a room. General accusations can be argued with. Records cannot. You wrote all of that down? Grant asked. I did, I said. Because once I understood what I was looking at, it would have been foolish not to. He looked away first. Men like Grant always do when their confidence runs out. They are comfortable with numbers until the numbers begin speaking for someone else. Vanessa rested both hands in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. She was no longer trying to play the loving daughter-in-law. Good. Costumes are exhausting. And this is what? She asked. Your proof that we care about the future? No, I said. It is proof that none of you were waiting for me to make my own decisions in my own time. You were circling the edges, testing doors, checking hinges, trying to find the easiest way in. Daniel looked stricken now, but I did not soften. I had done enough softening in my life. I did not confront any of you because confrontation would have been wasted, I said. People who want access always become more careful when they know they are being watched. I preferred honesty. The accidental kind. The kind people reveal when they think the woman at the center of the table is too lonely to notice what is happening around her. Outside, the afternoon light had flattened into the pale gray that comes before early winter dusk. The room reflected it back in silver and shadow. Walter's portrait above the sideboard seemed to watch over the whole scene with the same dry patience he used to wear during business meetings. I felt steadier beneath that gaze than I had in months. Not sadder, not angrier, simply steadier. So what then? Russell asked, his voice rougher than before. You made notes. You listened at doors. You sat on it for months. What was the plan? At that, I almost smiled. Because that was the first truly useful question anyone had asked all afternoon. The plan, I said, was to stop reacting like a wounded mother and start thinking like the person who still owned every important signature in this family. Vanessa's eyes lifted to mine. There was at last. Not fear, not quite. Respect, unwilling and sharp. She had finally recognized the problem. I was not cornered. I had never been cornered. I had simply gone quiet while they mistook patience for surrender. In December, I said, I scheduled a meeting in Charlotte with someone none of you knew I had retained. Not because I wanted to fight, because I wanted precision. I wanted to know exactly what could be protected, exactly what could be changed, and exactly how much of your interest in my well-being would survive if the terms shifted beneath your feet. Daniel swallowed hard. Ashley looked from him to Vanessa and back again. Grant sat motionless. Russell frowned. But Vanessa, for the first time since lunch began, did not seem to know which expression would serve her best. Who did you meet with? She asked. I closed the folder halfway, not enough to hide it, just enough to remind them that I controlled the pace. A woman named Evelyn Hart, I said. And after 1 hour in her office, I understood something very comforting. It turns out there are many ways to give people exactly what they ask for. Vanessa held my gaze for a long moment after I said Evelyn Hart's name, and I could almost see the calculations moving behind her eyes. She knew enough to understand that I had not driven 2 hours to Charlotte in December for conversation and coffee. Women like Vanessa respect one thing above all others, even if they never admit it. They respect preparation. Not kindness. Not age. Not grief. Preparation. Daniel leaned forward first. Mom, he said, keeping his voice low, why would you do that without telling me? I turned to him slowly. Why would I need to tell you? The question seemed to land harder than if I had raised my voice. He sat back in his chair, and for a moment he looked exactly like the little boy who used to stand in the kitchen after breaking something precious, hoping sincerity might arrive before consequences did. But Daniel was not a little boy anymore, And this was not a cracked lamp or a missed curfew. This was a man who had sat through months of carefully worded conversations about his mother's affairs and told himself silence was the same thing as innocence. "Because I am your son," he said. "Yes," I replied. And that is exactly why I waited so long before accepting what was happening. That left him with nothing useful to say. Ashley looked from him to me with the uneasy expression of someone discovering that family dynamics are not as soft and forgiving as she had always assumed. Grant reached for his cup again and finally took a sip, though by then the coffee could not have been worth drinking. Russell rubbed a hand over his chin. Vanessa, however, had moved into a new kind of attention. The kind predators reserve for another creature that has unexpectedly shown teeth. "And what did this attorney tell you?" she asked. "That depends," I said. "Do you want the polite answer or the useful one?" Her mouth flattened. "The truth would be nice." "The truth," I said, "is that Evelyn Hart listened for 40 minutes without interrupting me once. I told her about the dinner in August, the calls in September, the questions in October and November. The way concern kept arriving in language that sounded generous and ended in access. Then she asked me a very simple question. She asked whether I still had full legal control over every major asset Walter and I built together. I told her yes. She asked whether I was of sound mind. I told her yes. She asked whether anyone in my family believed those things would remain true forever. I told her absolutely not. Grant lowered his cup. Russell stopped rubbing his chin. Ashley looked almost offended on my behalf, which would have touched me if it had come 6 months earlier. "That is ridiculous," Daniel said. "No one thinks you are not of sound mind." "No," I asked. "Then why did Vanessa tell Ellen Burrows that older widows sometimes need help before sentiment turns into mismanagement? Why did you ask about in-person bank authorization? Why did Ashley suddenly become interested in appraisals? Why did Russell ask about access roads and Grant ask about title status? Sound minds do not usually get surrounded by so much administrative curiosity." No one answered. There was a peculiar stillness in the room then, the kind that comes when people realize they are no longer participating in a family conversation, but standing inside a record of their own behavior. Outside, the light had dimmed enough that the windows reflected the room back at us. I could see our shapes in the glass, layered over the gray lawn beyond. My own face looked calmer in reflection than it felt from the inside. Not cold, not triumphant, just settled. Evelyn had noticed that too. I remembered the way she sat in her office, one hand resting lightly on a legal pad, her voice steady and unhurried. She was in her late 50s, silverat. The temples, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked expensive without trying too hard. Her office was on the 10th floor of a brick building in Charlotte, with a clear view of the city and a bookshelf full of law binders that had seen actual use. She did not waste time performing warmth, and I liked her immediately for that. "Mrs. Whitmore," she had said after hearing me out, "families often become most transparent when they believe the timeline is shifting in their favor. The mistake most people make is responding emotionally before they have adjusted the structure." I remember sitting across from her with my gloves folded in my lap, feeling something unclench in me for the first time in months. "Adjusted the structure," I repeated. "Yes," she said. "You do not need a confrontation. You need terms." Terms. It is a beautiful word when spoken by someone who understands that dignity needs architecture. I told her I did not want a public humiliation. I did not want a vindictive spectacle. I did not even want to disinherit anyone out of anger. What I wanted, I said, was something simpler. I wanted the truth of their intentions to matter. I wanted greed, if proven, to cost something. Evelyn had nodded as if I had asked for the weather. "That can be arranged," she said. Back in the dining room, Vanessa's eyes remained fixed on me. "What terms?" she asked. "The kind that reveal character," I said. "The kind that separate family from appetite." Daniel dragged a hand over his face. "Can we please stop talking in riddles?" "I am not talking in riddles," I said. "I am telling you what happened. In December, I met with Evelyn. In January, I met with her again. We reviewed everything. The original estate documents, the trust, the real property deeds, the investment accounts, the charitable provisions Walter and I had drafted years ago and never fully updated. Every page, every signature, every opening that still belonged to me because I was alive, competent, and, contrary to family rumor, perfectly capable of reading my own paperwork." Ashley looked toward Vanessa then. as though hoping she might smooth this into something manageable. Vanessa did not look back. She was listening too carefully now. "And what did you change?" Russell asked. "Enough," I said. "Enough to make this afternoon useful." Grant frowned. "Useful for who?" "For me," I said. "And for the truth." I reached into the folder and drew out another document, this one on heavier paper. The room tracked the movement of my hand with embarrassing devotion. They had all become so used to thinking of the future as something they would inherit that they had forgotten the present still belonged to me. "Evelyn explained something very interesting," I said. "She told me that people often assume inheritance is a reward for proximity. Time spent at holidays. Calls made when someone is ill. Helpful opinions offered over roast chicken and pie. But inheritance is not a reward. It is a decision. And decisions can include conditions." Daniel stared at me. Grant went motionless. Ashley's mouth parted. Russell looked confused for half a second, then uneasy. Vanessa alone understood immediately. I saw it in the tightening around her eyes. That was the moment she knew the board had changed while she was still admiring the pieces. "Conditions," she said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. I set the document back inside the folder and closed it with deliberate care. "Yes," I said. "And before any of you imagine this was impulsive, let me save you the effort. By the time I invited you here today, every important paper had already been reviewed, updated, witnessed, and secured. All I needed now was to see who still smiled when they thought the old arrangement favored them." Vanessa did smile. Not broadly, not foolishly, but enough. It was there in the slight lift at one corner of her mouth, in the way her shoulders eased back against the chair, in the almost invisible return of confidence to her eyes. She had heard the word conditions, yes, but she had also heard something else that mattered more to her. She had heard that papers existed, that updates had been made, that arrangements were in place. To a woman like Vanessa, paperwork was not frightening by itself. Paperwork was terrain, and terrain, she believed, could still be navigated by the people bold enough to move first. Daniel was not as composed. He kept glancing between me and the folder, then toward Vanessa, as though one of us might still rescue him from understanding his own role in the afternoon. Ashley had gone very still again, that same stiff, pretty stillness people mistake for grace when it is usually only discomfort in expensive clothes. Grant and Russell looked like businessmen caught at the wrong end of a contract review. No one liked uncertainty when they had already started spending certainty in their heads. I let them sit with it for a moment, then reached for the house phone on the sideboard behind me. Old-fashioned, cream-colored, heavy in the hand. Walter had never trusted flimsy things. I pressed one button and waited. Vanessa watched me carefully now. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Finishing what I started," I said. On the second ring, Martha answered from the kitchen. Martha had worked in this house 3 days a week for almost 19 years. She knew where every serving spoon belonged, which roses needed cutting back in spring, and when not to interrupt a difficult conversation. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "Please ask Miss Hart to come in," I replied. Silence fell so fast after that it almost had a sound. Daniel looked up first. Ashley's hand slipped from her glass. Russell frowned as if he had misheard me. Grant muttered, "You brought a lawyer here?" But Vanessa did not speak at all. Her face did not collapse. She was too disciplined for that. It simply changed. The softness left. The decorative warmth. The little social glow she wore so well. What remained was calculation stripped of perfume. "You invited counsel to a family lunch?" she asked at last. "No," I said. "I invited counsel to a legal discussion that happened to include family." Daniel pushed his chair back an inch before catching himself. "Mom, that is not fair. You made it sound like this was just a conversation." "It is a conversation," I said. "You are all speaking quite freely. I simply prefer to have accuracy in the room." The door at the far end of the dining room opened before anyone could answer. Evelyn Hart stepped in with a dark leather case in one hand and a wool coat draped neatly over the other arm. She had removed her gloves, and the sharp winter air clung faintly to her as she crossed the threshold. She was dressed in charcoal again, with a narrow silver watch at her wrist and the kind of calm expression that only comes from competence. Martha hovered only long enough to set another cup near the head of the table, then disappeared without a word. I had always appreciated people who understood timing. "Mrs. Whitmore," Evelyn said with a slight nod. Then she took in the room exactly once. Not hurried, not theatrical, Just one sweep of her eyes. And in that sweep, every person at the table was measured, filed, and understood. "Thank you for coming in, Miss Hart," I said. "Please join us." "Of course." She took the chair to my right and set the leather case on the table with a quiet, solid sound. Vanessa spoke before anyone else could. I was not aware this was a formal proceeding. Evelyn turned to her with perfect courtesy. "It is not a court proceeding, Mrs. Cole, but it does concern legal instruments. Formality tends to be useful." Vanessa did not like being answered that way. I could tell. Some women are accustomed to controlling tone by controlling social comfort. Evelyn had no interest in comfort, only clarity. Daniel looked at me as if the ground beneath him had shifted. "You planned all of this?" he asked. "Yes," I said, carefully. He exhaled and looked away. Hurt, embarrassment, and resentment passed over his face in such quick succession that I almost pitied him. Almost. But pity is expensive, and I had spent enough of it already. "For the record," Evelyn said, opening her case and removing a clean stack of documents clipped in sections. "Mrs. Whitmore requested my presence because she wished to discuss her updated estate structure in a setting where all relevant parties could hear the same information at the same time. That reduces later confusion." Grant gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Relevant parties. That is one way to put it." "It is the accurate way," Evelyn said. Russell leaned forward. "Updated how?" "You will hear that shortly," Evelyn replied. "But before we proceed, I want to be very clear about something. Mrs. Whitmore is under no obligation to explain any private legal planning in this setting. She has chosen to do so. That choice should not be mistaken for weakness, negotiability, or confusion." No one said a word after that. They could not. Evelyn had done in 2 sentences what I had spent months preparing the room to understand. She had named the thing directly. Not grief. Not family friction. Power. Power still held. Power still competent. Power not available for gentle theft. Vanessa folded her hands again, but the gesture had changed. Before, it had been decorative. Now it was defensive. "With respect," she said, "if there are documents to review, perhaps they should be sent to everyone's attorney before being discussed like this." "You are welcome to retain anyone you please after today," Evelyn said. "But the documents are effective regardless." That was the first moment the room truly changed. Not when Evelyn walked in. Not even when she spoke. It changed when the others understood that whatever had been done was not hypothetical. Not pending. Not a warning. Effective. Present tense. Already real. I watched the meaning settle over them one by one. Daniel's face drained first. Ashley stared at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves into better news. Grant sat completely still. Russell looked annoyed in the specific way men do when they realize timing has defeated them. Vanessa held on the longest. She lifted her chin slightly and asked the one question left that still carried some dignity. "What exactly is in those documents?" Evelyn rested one hand on the top page, then looked not at Vanessa, but at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. I nodded once. "Please," I answered. Evelyn drew the first document free, adjusted it squarely before her, and said in the calmest voice in the room, "Very well. I will begin with the revised inheritance provisions, and then I will read the supplemental clause that governs eligibility under the new structure." Evelyn did not rush. That was part of her power. She adjusted the top page, removed her glasses from a slim black case, and placed them on with the kind of deliberate calm that makes nervous people feel their own pulse. Then she began reading in a voice, so even it seemed to flatten every attempt at interruption before it could take shape. She started with the ordinary provisions first, and that was intentional. The primary residence remained in the estate structure under my control for the duration of my life. Certain investment accounts had been reorganized. Long-standing charitable commitments Walter and I had discussed for years had now been formalized. A percentage of liquid assets had been directed to 2 educational foundations in North Carolina, one for nursing scholarships and one for first-generation college students. The mountain acreage outside Asheville had been placed under separate supervision with instructions that prevented immediate sale without specific review conditions. The silver, jewelry, and personal collections had been inventoried, assigned categories, and attached to separate memoranda. On the surface, it sounded almost generous. Ashley would still receive something. Grant and Russell would not be left out entirely. Daniel, too, remained named. Even Vanessa, through Daniel's share, was clearly not facing the empty-handed disaster she had perhaps begun to fear. As the reading continued, I watched the room change by tiny degrees. Relief arrived first, and nothing reveals character faster than relief that comes too soon. Ashley exhaled and sat back. Grant's shoulders loosened. Russell even reached again for his cup, apparently encouraged by the possibility that the afternoon might still end in paperwork rather than humiliation. Daniel looked shaken but hopeful, as though he had convinced himself that whatever I had discovered, whatever I had prepared, I still could not bring myself to alter the old emotional mathematics of motherhood. Vanessa listened with a stillness so refined it might have passed for indifference, but I saw the return of calculation in her eyes. She was already measuring the terms, already deciding what could be influenced later, what could be challenged, what could be softened through time, pressure, or proximity. She thought she was hearing the outline of a settlement. She did not yet understand she was only being walked to the edge of the cliff. Evelyn turned one page and continued in the same steady tone. She read the baseline allocations, then the procedural language, then the authority clauses concerning oversight, review, and fiduciary handling. No one interrupted. The rhythm of legal language had begun doing its quiet work on them. Long sentences soothe the greedy when they think the important danger has already passed. That is the advantage of patience. By the time people realize where the knife is hidden, they have usually relaxed enough to lean toward it. Vanessa was the first to speak, and even then she chose her moment carefully. "This all sounds quite reasonable," she said, folding her hands again. "I am glad to hear there is structure in place." Evelyn did not look up. "There is," she said. Daniel glanced at Vanessa, taking comfort from the word reasonable, as if it were a life raft tossed into deep water. Ashley asked, "So the distributions are fixed?" "They are conditional," Evelyn replied. Just 2 words, calmly spoken, but they landed with a different weight this time. Russell lowered his cup without drinking. Grant's eyes moved back to the papers. Daniel's brow tightened. Vanessa did not move at all. She had gone perfectly still again, which told me she understood before the others did that the most dangerous part of any arrangement often comes after the line everyone assumes is the end. "Conditional in what way?" Daniel asked. Evelyn lifted the next page. The paper made a dry, precise sound in the room. "Under the revised estate structure," she said, "all named beneficiaries remain subject to a supplemental eligibility clause attached to this instrument and incorporated by reference into the trust administration schedule." Ashley blinked. Grant frowned. Russell muttered under his breath, though not loudly enough to count as courage. Vanessa's gaze sharpened like glass catching winter light. She knew now. Not the exact wording, perhaps. Not yet. But she knew enough to understand that the real document had only just begun. Evelyn continued. "Because Mrs. Whitmore expressed a clear and documented desire to ensure that inheritance not reward coercion, manipulation, interference, or opportunistic conduct directed toward her person, residence, medical autonomy, legal decision-making, or asset control during her lifetime, the following eligibility condition has been adopted as binding." The room did not merely go quiet. It sealed. No cups touched saucers. No one shifted in a chair. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed suddenly far away, as though the house itself had stepped back to listen. Daniel stared at Evelyn, then at me. Ashley's lips parted without sound. Grant looked like a man who had just remembered every careless thing he had said in the last 12 months. Russell's face tightened into offended disbelief, the expression of someone who thinks consequences are poor manners. Vanessa alone held her posture, but the color had changed at the base of her throat. Very slightly. Enough for me. Evelyn adjusted the page once, not because she needed to, but because she believed in the dignity of exact reading. Then she spoke the sentence that had been waiting patiently for months to enter the world. "Any beneficiary who is found, by documented pattern of conduct, written communication, witness statement, or credible corroborating evidence, to have applied pressure upon Mrs. Whitmore to surrender control of property, residence, finances, legal authority, or personal independence prior to her death, or to have acted in anticipation of such surrender for material advantage, shall be deemed to have voluntarily forfeited all beneficial interest under this estate and trust structure, without exception." Evelyn stopped there. She did not dramatize it. She did not repeat it. She simply reached the period at the end of the sentence and let silence do what silence does best. Howard Pike, the attorney Vanessa had once mentioned in my hearing as someone the family could always consult later if things got complicated, was not in that room. He did not need to be. The sentence itself was enough. It stood in the center of the table like cold iron. Daniel looked at me with something close to horror, as though he had only just realized that words spoken over pot roast and pie could survive long enough to become legal weather. Ashley stared at the papers as if they had betrayed her personally. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. Russell gave the faintest shake of his head, not in denial but in recognition. Vanessa did not speak. That was the part one will remember for the rest of my life. Not a gasp, not a protest, not even outrage. Just stillness. Because the only people who understand the full danger of a sentence like that are the people who know exactly how much of themselves it was written for. Evelyn lowered the page half an inch and looked over the top of her glasses. There are evidentiary provisions attached, she said. And before anyone asks, yes, they are specific. That was when Vanessa finally found her voice, though it came out lower than before, stripped of all performance. You cannot possibly mean to apply that broadly. Evelyn turned to her. Mrs. Cole, she said, I mean to apply it exactly as written. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the sentence itself had taken up all the available air in the room and left the rest of us to survive on whatever pride or honesty we had stored away. Vanessa was the first to recover, though not fully. She straightened 1 inch in her chair and turned to Evelyn with a look that tried very hard to become outrage before fear could show through. Documented pattern, she repeated. Credible corroborating evidence. That language is absurdly broad. Evelyn removed her glasses and folded them with calm precision. It is not broad, she said. It is deliberately structured. There is a difference. Daniel looked from one woman to the other, as if he were watching a door close in slow motion. Mom, he said, you cannot seriously believe we were trying to take advantage of you. I turned to him then, not sharply, not with anger, but with the tired clarity that only comes after disappointment has had time to harden into understanding. Daniel, I said, belief has very little to do with it now. He stared at me. Then what does? Behavior, I said. Timing, repetition, intention wrapped in courtesy. The things people reveal when they think no one is keeping track. Ashley spoke next, her voice thin and unsteady. Grandma, I never pressured you. You did not pressure me directly, I said. You practiced entitlement in smaller ways and assumed it would not count. Most people do. Her cheeks flushed bright pink. She looked wounded, but not because she had been wronged. Because she had been recognized. Grant leaned forward, forearms on the table. So what happens now? You just decide everyone had bad motives and erase them? No, Evelyn said before I needed to answer. Mrs. Whitmore does not decide arbitrarily. The clause applies where conduct is documented and materially relevant. Notes, communications, witness accounts, patterns of inquiry, property-related assumptions, attempts to influence access or timing, and any coordinated effort to reduce her independence for financial advantage can all be evaluated. Russell let out a low breath and looked away. There it was again, that uncomfortable recognition people feel when general language suddenly sounds very personal. Vanessa turned to me at last, dropping any pretense of softness. This is punishment, she said. No, I replied. Punishment would have been public embarrassment without warning. This is structure. I am simply no longer rewarding behavior that was never rooted in love. The room stayed quiet after that, but it was no longer the earlier kind of silence. That had been suspense. This was exposure. The kind that leaves people searching backward through their own words, trying to remember which moments might have lasted long enough to become evidence. Daniel pressed both hands flat against the table. So what are you saying? That because of a few conversations, because people asked questions, because we worried about the future, we lose everything. He said everything the way hungry people always do, as if any reduction from expectation feels identical to ruin. I am saying, I answered, that inheritance is not owed simply because you stood nearby while I grew older. It is not a family participation trophy. It is a private decision about what my life built and where my judgment believes it should go. Evelyn opened the next section of papers and slid 1 page forward, not across the table, just far enough to mark a transition. To clarify the revised distribution under disqualification provisions, she said, Any interest forfeited under the supplemental eligibility clause is redirected according to alternate assignment. Those assets do not revert to remaining contested parties by default. That finally broke the room open. Grant sat upright. Russell frowned hard enough to crease his forehead. Ashley whispered, "Redirected where?" Daniel stared at Evelyn, as though the meaning might change if he looked at her long enough. Vanessa did not speak. She already knew the answer would be worse than the question. I folded my hands and answered for myself. Some of it goes where Walter and I always meant it to go, but kept postponing. The scholarship funds. The church restoration grant. The hospice endowment in Buncombe County. Some of it goes to people who were kind when no one thought kindness would be rewarded. Martha has a provision. My groundskeeper has one as well. And one person in this family who never once asked me for anything beyond time and stories will receive more than the rest of you expected. Ashley looked almost offended. Grant looked inconvenienced. Russell looked cheated. Daniel looked lost. Vanessa looked at me with something colder now, not disbelief, not even anger. Calculation with nowhere left to go. Who? Daniel asked. Lydia, I said. My great-niece Lydia was 24 years old, taught second grade in Raleigh, and wrote me handwritten thank you notes after every birthday, check no matter how modest it was. She called on Sundays without rushing me off the phone. She visited in November just to help me sort books for the library sale and never once mentioned the house, the land, the accounts, or what might happen someday. She noticed when my left knee bothered me in cold weather and moved the heavier box without making me ask. She belonged to that rare category of person Vanessa had never learned how to imitate. Someone whose decency survives when there is no audience. Lydia, Ashley said, almost laughing. In disbelief. She is barely even around. Exactly, I said. She came when she wanted nothing. Daniel lowered his head. I could almost see the arithmetic collapsing behind his eyes. Years of assumptions, reduced in a single afternoon to what they had always really been. Assumptions. Vanessa tried one last time. Margaret, if this is about misunderstandings, we can clear them up. There is no need to make permanent decisions over hurt feelings. That was the last mistake she made, and perhaps the most revealing. Hurt feelings. As though this had all been an emotional overreaction by a lonely older woman who had taken a few comments too personally. As though months of circling, probing, timing, and positioning could still be swept into the soft little basket where manipulative people store every truth they do not want named. I stood then, slowly, with one hand resting on the table. Martha appeared in the doorway almost at once, not because I had called for her, but because women who have spent their lives running households understand when a meal is over even if no one touches dessert. I looked at Vanessa first, then Daniel, then the others. This is not about hurt feelings, I said. It is about revealed character. And character has consequences when signatures are still mine. No one answered. There was nothing left to say that would not make them smaller. Evelyn closed her case with the quiet finality of a judge setting down a pen. Outside, the winter light had thinned to silver blue, and the first porch lantern had come on against the early evening. The house felt different already. Not emptier. Lighter. As if something stale had finally been carried out. I picked up the folder and held it against my side. You all came here expecting the future to open for you, I said. It did. Just not in the direction you planned. Then I turned and walked toward the doorway. Not hurried. Not dramatic. Just certain. Behind me, chairs remained still. Cups remained half full. No one followed. And for the first time since Walter died, I did not feel like the widow at the center of a house everyone was waiting to divide. I felt like its rightful keeper again, with enough years, enough judgment, and enough peace left to decide that the rest of my life would not be managed by people who mistook patience for permission.